It was really about thinking and, philosophy and these things. And while there was an attachment to ritual and magic as we see it, I really don't honestly see magic in any different sense than, and I'm going to get in trouble for this from some people, but, prayers are also incantations. And no matter what religion you follow, the end result is very much the same, right? When you're inciting, you are, speaking the words, you are looking for that energy to move out into the universe and find that destination that you've sent it to.
Right.
Whatever God it may be that you follow, whatever, whatever, right? So the problem here with Crowley's image is that people misunderstand his beliefs. They misunderstand what he was doing. And maybe even he misunderstood at some point his own power or his own ability of perhaps, how energy moves and how it moves through the constructs of time and the universe. And so, what energy did he leave behind at the house, right? But unfortunately, in the community around the house, this seems to be the problem, is that they believe that he worshipped Satan and he was a satanic person and that he brought bad things to the property. And I don't really believe that myself. I don't feel those energies from the property. I do know he was a part of it. But again, we have so many other people who are a part of that home, right? So while he left his energy stamped there, so did the Fraser clan, who had it for 150 years. Right? We have the stories of James Fraser, who lost his head in London. And did you read that story about the sound of the head thumping down the gallery hall?
Yep.
Yeah, because they believe that's his head.
Yep, I've heard the stories.
Ball, right? down the hall, the central hall of the home. So there are stories there. There are ghost stories around the house. There are numerous things. But the house was also a private residence. So after Crowley purchased it, he sold it to a private citizen. And they lived in that home for quite a number of years. And then the house was empty for a while. And then it became a hotel. And then it was, sort of passed on again. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because one of my relatives owned the home.
Oh, really?
I did not know this until
Wow.
I started digging. He is the person that sold it to Jimmy Page. Really weird kind of things. Now, Jimmy Page bought the property, but he never lived in it. And at the time he purchased it, it was already sort of beginning to be a little bit run down. It had a couple of issues, the roof and numerous other things. And so he bought it and he never really moved in. He had a friend come in and look after the property pretty much the entire time. And the house fell into a pretty good state of disrepair at that point. And then it was sold, and Page sold it to a family from Holland, and they used it as their summer home. So they did some repairs and they fixed a part of the roof, and they did a few things. And what happened was they went away, I guess, and shopping or some such as it goes, and the house caught fire.
And there was a fire. Yeah.
Right. And there was a fire. Now it was contained to one area of the house at the time, but it did burn through the roof and it did have a number of things. So they never really fixed it after that. And then the house sat empty and sort of, again, derelict for some time. And then the new owner, who was traveling with his wife on vacation up there, saw that it was for sale and he purchased it. So, so then, the story sort of grows from there. Now,
there were actually two fires.
Yes. And this
was there not?
Yes, there was. There's also a very old story that goes back to the Middle Ages that there was a kirk on the site. And a kirk is an old, we call them churches, right? Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
And that the rumor has it that somehow in the vicinity, I'm not exactly sure, and I have to do more digging in this because there's no written proof of this, so it's just a lot of compilation, but that all the parishioners burned inside the church. And so, the property was doomed from that point forward that, this happened. There was a kirk. It's now just sort of walls down in the chapel, but they say that there was a church on the hill at the site of where the home is. So with that big, long sort of tie-in, let's talk more about the cool stories, right? The ghost stories, the stories of Aleister Crowley. And, I should mention too, the song remains the same. The film, know this, but if you've seen it, there's a sequence where Jimmy Page is climbing that rock face to the top where the hermit is standing and looks down. And that's actually out the back of Boleskine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that rock face, that mountain that he was climbing was literally on the property of Boleskine. And that was filmed about a year after he bought the property.
Oh,
so
very cool.
A bunch of cool sort of things that tie in. So let's talk about what kind of other ghost stories did you find or other interesting tales? What did you find about Aleister Crowley in the house? That's what I'm curious.
Just that he used the house as his foundation to conduct his
rituals.
His crazy rituals. Yeah.
How crazy were these rituals? I mean, I read about them. I don't know. I don't really find them all that crazy. Maybe that's me. But he was really trying to invoke angels.
For the time period, I think it was pretty nuts. Maybe not compared to today, but for that time period.
You think? Because the Victorian era had so many secret societies. And, we somehow give the Masons a pass, right? And they have some very interesting rituals. And yet, we seem to somehow allow the Masons a free pass in terms of what is considered the norm in a weird sort of way. Yet we talk about...
They're such a secret society, though, that...
Are they?
It's very difficult to actually find out, the stories of which I think have just gotten blown way out of perspective about what the Masons do compared to reality. I mean, you hear the stories of, the sacrifices and it's like, obviously that doesn't happen.
No, there really isn't. But at the end of the day, they do have some interesting history. And I actually have the full volumes of Masonry from 1920s.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yep. You can read all about every single thing that goes with from initiation to the 33rd level. Are all into the Victorian era had a lot of this going on. There was a lot of secret societies in the Victorian era. And so what Crowley was doing wasn't really that out there at the time. I know you might think it was, but the Victorian era was pretty out there. I mean, I spent a lot of my time teaching the darker side of the Victorian era, these secret societies, all of these things. And honestly, Crowley, I don't know. I think Crowley's persona blew up when Jimmy Page purchased the property. And
he was a huge fan.
Well, he was a huge fan, right? And I think that's what really propelled Crowley into the 1970s. I think that for the most part, had Page and, all of these things with Zeppelin and everything, people were like, oh, it was Jimmy Page's fault because, and this and that. and they were blaming Aleister Crowley and all of these things. And I really believe that, as interesting as Crowley was, if Page hadn't have purchased the property and hadn't had this public image, I'm not so sure Crowley would be as well known today as he is.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I think he would have been a bit like Madame Blavatsky or even Anton LaVey. How many people go around talking about Anton LaVey today? Hardly anyone, right? And LaVey was, really the first Satanist in terms of creating it as a religion.
Yeah.
So yet people want to wind back to Aleister, and poor Mr. Crowley gets all the right, all the people giving him a hard time. And to me, there needs to be more understanding. And this is how we make a difference with the property too, right? We get people to realize that he was a person and not a persona, right? That's kind of the thing. His persona supersedes his the actual person. And we know how that happens. Things just sort of blow up and stories happen. And then you got to try and find what's real and what's not. And it's like the great stories in terms of the ghosts that are on the property too, right? Like James Fraser's head rolling down the hallway. And people have heard this, right? People have heard this happen.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the fire. There's the other connection for me. The fire in 2019. So the gentleman who has the foundation, Keith, he purchased the home in April of 2019. The fire took place in July 31st, my birthday.
Oh, there you go.
How wacky is that?
Oh,
right?
for sure. Yeah.
I've got relatives who own the place. I've got relatives who possibly were there when Fraser was there. I've got a fire on my birthday. That fire right now, I've read numerous stories about how it started. And I think that that's one of the things that right now we're really hoping is that people will understand is that this property is valuable in terms of its heritage. And not just because of who owned it, but because of the architecture and the location as well, right? This home was a beautiful, Georgian style hunting lodge with vaulted roofs inside and exposed beams and all of these things. And the funny thing is, and I want to reach out to people there who are Outlander fans, because while it's not shown in the television show, in the books, this property is actually mentioned because this is the hunting lodge, and James Fraser makes an appearance in Outlander on television, right? So we have a connection there that this property shows up in those stories as well because it was a real place, a real family, right? And I think that's the important thing about it. But we have these great stories like Fraser's head, rolling down the hall, or there's a story of a possible tunnel that leads from under the house to the cemetery.
To the cemetery, yeah.
Right? So we've got that story too. And there is certainly a vault under the old servants' quarters in the back of the home. There is an underground storage vault where you would have kept dry goods and things for cold storage, because in that time there were no refrigerators. So casks and barrels and things like that would have been kept down there, possibly cheese and things when, it was colder and it was below grade. So it would have been a good cold room for storage. Like I said, there's rumors about this tunnel. I'm really excited to be able to go to the property when it's ready.